welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelson.
Hi everyone, tonight we're reading Judges chapter 12. Let's read it. It's not a long section. We have 4 judges in 15 verses. So let's start right here and read 4 judges tonight, the end of Jephthah, and 3 really quick, almost incidental judges, but we're going to study them one by one. So we've been looking at Jephthah. Last week we concentrated seriously on the vow of Jephthah, and I don't know if you've thought much about that in the last week, but I continue to hear that, and the ache of Jephthah when he saw his virgin daughter, his only child. I mean, she is clearly a very different, a stark difference between her and all these other judges who have 30, 40, 60, lots of kids, which of course means they've had lots of wives. You don't have you don't have 30 kids with one wife. Not 30. All right. Not 30. I don't want to know. But every Bible interpreter that talks about the volume of children mentions the multiple wives that are required to have that. It is standard practice for kings in those days, or judges, or prominent people, to have a harem, a dedicated band of women that he would have called his. It's Abrahamic, it's Jacobean, it's common.
Deuteronomy is that.
Okay, how'd that work out for him? Yeah, a lot of guys did that. So the every Bible commentator explains these multiple children, meaning multiple wives. So the contrast is clear, isn't it? With Jephthah having just one child, and then the ache that's in him as he saw his own hope for progeny and continued legacy gone, as he vowed, and had to fulfill that vow by letting his virgin daughter not be killed, we saw that last week, but rather be dedicated almost in temple service. I read earlier that there was probably in Jephthah's house several rooms on the ground floor. How they know that, I'm not sure, except by archaeology. And that one of those rooms, as we call them rooms, would have been for animals that he preserved for animal sacrifice. And because of the use of the male noun in whatever comes out from my house in that vow, whatever was male, the implication was that it would be an animal sacrifice that would be pure, and etc. So I've thought a lot more about that vow over the week, and the pain in Jephthah. Look, I've got 2 grandsons. They're champions. They're beautiful. Who knows how many more my kids will produce? I don't produce my own grandsons, but I mean, I would if I could, because they're such a joy. But I just want to see that not my name, but that our family continues. And so the pain of Jephthah in his loss, I think, is severe. Certainly in a Jewish world, that makes sense. There were seasons when they were betrothed young. We don't know if this was one of those. A lot of things could have happened, didn't happen. What we have is what happened. So here we see in chapter 12 that Ephraim comes up. Some guys from Ephraim come up and kvetch. Now, this is not their first time. They did that earlier with Gideon and said, hey, how come you didn't get us involved? Meaning, hey, we're the strong guys. Why didn't you call on us? We know how to dominate. We're front rowers. We've got the winger that'll take down it was so clear that they thought of themselves as somebody. We are not to be dismissed. So the men of Ephraim were summoned and crossed to Zephon and said to Jephthah, hey, why did you cross over? Cross over. I mean, that's clearly the word, ovarta. I think one of the Bible versions said, why did you go up to fight against the sons of Ammon? But to go fight against them, you had to aver, cross over. And what did you cross over? Aver Hayardain, cross the Jordan River. And that word, by the way, aver, Hebrew, it's all the same. A Hebrew is one who crosses over. Originally, Abram is called Abram the Hebrew. That's his first official nickname. Why? Because he crossed over from Haran in the north in Assyria, crossed over the Jordan and came into what we call the Promised Land. Hebrew, the language, is a direct result of that. But Hebrew, the language, is an amalgam language itself. It wasn't brand new, never been done before. It was an amalgamation of all the things that Abram brought with him from, what was the city from which he came? Ur of the Chaldees. It's got to be one of the craziest names. Hey, where are you from? Ur. Yeah, that'll do. I mean, I don't know. That came in second. When he came, so that's, if you will, Babylonian. The Akkadian, the Babylonian, the Sumerian, those languages were extant in the year 2000 BCE or so when Abram was called. As a result, he brought with him lots of language. Some people say, and the archaeologists have good arguments about this, that in the land we call Israel today was a people at the time of Abram called the Habiru, 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 Hebrew. You hear it, it's the same. And that their language, Habiru, influenced Hebrew a lot. Well, it shouldn't surprise us. Languages criss and cross globally. Danish, Norwegian, Anglo-Saxon, French, Italian, Romance. I mean, there's a lot of rap. English is a mutt language. Hebrew is a mutt language. Yiddish is a mutt language. Mutt meaning an amalgam of others. So here, crossing over. Why did you cross over to fight against the sons of Ammon? Hey, without calling us to go with you. We're going to burn your house down. Excuse me. We just won a battle. It's been a lot of years. How many years? Like 14 years of pain and suffering. And we just took them down. Where have you been, you guys? This is the second time. And remember that Gideon accommodated these guys. But Jephthah is going to lace into them and say, how dare you? Listen to what he says in verse 2. I and my people were at great strife. There's the word reeve, with the sons of Ammon. When I called, you didn't deliver. So who are you going to call? Ghostbusters or the Ephraimites? The Ephraimites didn't show up. I sent you messages. I sent you emails. I called. You didn't answer. Thanks a lot. Now show up when the victory's over. I mean, Jephthah's really ticked off. And I don't know if he's aggravated, particularly in light of his daughter's being sent to temple service, or if this is years later. We don't know exactly the time frame, but I'd be pretty aggravated. And you didn't deliver us. So, in fact, when I saw that you wouldn't deliver us, I took my life, he says in verse 3, into my own hand, and I did it. So he's saying, you no-showed, I showed, and I had a group of guys who helped. And get this, the Lord himself gave it into our hand. And so what are you doing here? That's what he says. So why did you come up to me this day to fight against me? Like, what's the point? Who died and made you pope? We don't need you. We didn't need you before. So go back to your pompous dwelling there in the north of Israel and have a nice day. But that's not exactly where he left it. That might have been the way a good man would have responded. But Jephthah gathered a whole lot of team and fought Ephraim. The men of Gilead defeated Ephraim because they said, psh. So here's the Ephraimites are paying out the guys who just won the battle. They still, even though they were insignificant, said, yeah, well, we're triumphal. You are fugitives of Ephraim, you Gileadites. They should be embarrassed. The way they're treating the guys who just won the battle and delivered Israel. It's such a sad contrast. Well, they haven't ever been on our side so far, In Joshua's time, to be fair, they did fight. But here they are saying, you guys ran away, verse 4, you guys ran away from us. You're fugitives of Ephraim. You are nobody. This is like trash talk or sledging in a cricket match or in a basketball game, Oh yeah, sure, go ahead and shoot that basket, come on. And you're going to, it's like when I play with my grandson and he shoots a basket and I really want him to get the basket into the ball into the basket. I really want him to do that. But sometimes this old competitive guy says, yeah, I can block him. Of course I can block him. I'm like 8 feet and he's like 2 feet, exaggerating. So every once in a while he'll go up for a shot and I'll just put my hand up and block the ball. And I could say at that point, which I won't, you think you're somebody. Go ahead, try to take your Saba on, and that would be in jest. And then he would, and pretty soon it won't be too long before he does take me down. When my son passed me, and then he was faster than me, it was a golden time in our life. I really treasure that moment when my burly size couldn't stop him, and his speed got around me, and he'd go in for a layup and score a basket. I mean, it was great to watch. But the Ephraimites weren't so noble and weren't so team thinking. You fugitives of Ephraim, psh, who do you think you are? They were pompous. They were not into what God said would be Commonwealth of Israel. I mean, how wicked are they to think they're somebody seriously important? They're a long way from Jerusalem. They're a long way from Shiloh or wherever the center of Judaism was at the time. They just happened to be a big bunch of guys. In the midst of Ephraim and in the midst of Manasseh, you're nobody and you're in nowhere place. The mockery was severe. Gileadites, verse 5, captured the fords of the Jordan opposite Ephraim. And it happened when any of the fugitives of Ephraim, so they won. The Gileadites, the Jephthah team, defeated the Ephraim team, right? But then there were some guys who changed shirts and said, yeah, we're from your team. And the test was nicknamed Shibboleth. And it is a common phrase, it's a common word used in literature from then on. To say he conducted a shibboleth or had a shibboleth is to say they ran a test to see if you're really one of us. Can you say the word shibboleth, or does it come out sibboleth? If it comes out sibboleth, you're with their team. If it comes out shibboleth, you're on our team. Because the Ephraimites couldn't say shh. That's what it is. So instead, it'd be like talking to somebody from the American South and trying to get them to talk like a Yankee or a Boston person. New Yorker trying to talk like a New Yorker, and you say, yeah, but can you talk like an Australian? Can you say the word g'day, mate? Right? And you hear a New York. You see what I mean? It's a language. It's an accent. It's a simple test. They might not have said, can you say the word shibboleth? Or if they're Canadian, they say out and about instead of out and about. It's a linguistic device by the which you determine where someone is from. So if they say, are you an Ephraimite? And he says no, then they would say to him, say now Shibboleth. But he said Sibboleth, for he couldn't pronounce it correctly. The Hebrew there is he couldn't davar, he couldn't say, he couldn't speak correctly. So they'd seize him and slew him at the fords of the Jordan. And that day, 42,000 Shibboleth speakers were ruined. Now that is so different than when after the Midianite victory and Gideon had the Ephraimites come and say, hey, how come you didn't call on us? I'm sorry, okay, fine, we'll get along. But here, Jephthah said, enough of you people. Now it never happens again that Ephraim and the men of Ephraim come up and say, hey, we're somebody. So obviously they learned their lesson, but 42,000 is an expensive lesson. It's called Civil War, and it is an elbowing that makes no sense. You've just come off a military victory. You've just won. You're filled with valor, pleasure, strength. You just beat up these guys from Ammon. You're feeling good. The Ephraimites come out, and the word comes down from headquarters. If they can't say Shibboleth, kill them, because they want to burn down Jephthah's house. Yeah. Now, burning down a house doesn't mean burning down a house. What does it mean?
Everyone.
That's right. We're going to take down all you guys. And we're going to destroy you. And it's not the house. I mean, a house. It's the house. The captain's house is the army. So they're basically saying, we're taking over this whole territory. They were bullies. So Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. He got a lot done in those 6 years. A lot done. And then the Gileadite died and was buried. And here's what it says. In our version, what does it say? Where was he buried?
One of the cities.
But it doesn't say that. It says Ba'arei Gilad, in the cities of Gilead. So the rabbis come up with it, wouldn't you know? You know what they do with this? That all of his body parts were buried across many cities. And how do you have many body parts buried in many cities? In what causes body parts to fall off? Leprosy. So they say he had leprosy. That's why he's buried in the cities of Gilead. Very clever, whether it's true or not. Why didn't it say in one of the cities? But I want you to see how people make interpretations out of Bible. And that word is in italics because it's not in the text. Italic doesn't mean important. Italic means it doesn't exist. They insert it to make it. That's the end of Jephthah. What an interesting fellow. good argument for being a man of faith. He's in the Hebrews 11 passage for a lot of reasons, but he lived it well. You just got to wonder about the 42,000 over whom he was presiding and sentencing. I mean, he really sentenced them to death. That whole Shibboleth idea came through him. He had to approve it. He's the judge. Not the way I want to live, but it's how he responded. A choiceless choice. Yeah, they're going to burn down the house, meaning they're going to take us down. And yet he could have sent them back to Ephraim. They could have lived happily ever after over there. Well, he didn't because they threatened him. And they were there up in his face. If they had sent an email and said, if you don't do this, we're going to take you down, he might have had more time or occasion. But here they are with torch in hand. So now we get to Ibzan of Bethlehem. It doesn't say Bethlehem of Judah, which it always says. So this is probably Benjamin of Zebulun, who's up north. Sort of like we have same towns in various states. Bethlehem's just a town name, not only in one location. There are 50 Springfields, one in every state. Pleasant name. So Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel after him. He's not his son. He's not the son of Jephthah. We don't know from where he comes. He just pops up on the scene. We do know his progeny is substantial. He's got 30 sons and 30 daughters. But what does he do with his daughters? He sends them out to Dan, to Naphtali, to Zebulun, to elsewhere. What's that for? Why do you send your daughters to other provinces? To gain support. It's a marriage. It's an alliance. It is political, definitively political. So the 30 daughters were conscripted to be married to those boys outside, still in the community of Israel, but definitely to solidify his political power. Ibzan's not a dummy at all, especially in light of what just happened with Ephraim. It makes great sense that should be what is highlighted here. And get this, he brought in 30 daughters from outside for his boys. So again, another politically aligning activity. So he's got 60 marriages that'll double bond, triple bond. This is better than benzene. He'll take care of all kinds of strength. And the community of Israel they can't go up against there because we've got his daughter. We can't go there because they've got our son, that kind of thing. And he judged Israel 7 years, and he died and was buried in Bethlehem. That's it. All we know of him is his political maneuvering and his multiple wives and therefore 30 kids. But he's a judge. He's just not listed in the Hall of Faith, and he doesn't have a whole lot about him. There's no fighting going on except in the 60 houses. We don't really know. There's no public fighting going on. Okay. Then the next judge is Elon the Zebulunite. He judged Israel 10 years. Then he died and was buried in the land of Zebulun. I mean, that is the most insignificant life story you can ever get for anybody, really. And this guy was born there in Zebulun. When he got his first career, he was a judge. He did that for 10 years. Then he died and he's buried. The end. I mean, that's got to be a dull story. And yet, judging Israel for 10 years without any incident, that is not to be diminished. When we look at the characteristics of some of the big guns, Gideon, next week we're going to start Samson, and boy, oh boy, that'll be a lot of weeks of this character who is at times brilliant and strong, and not just physically, and then other times as weak as a lamb. By contrast, and that's what you want to do when you read the Bible, you want to see the character that's compared to the next character and compared to the character before him. Look at the stream of historical consciousness and see how it flows to communicate something about each person. Elon the Zebulunite is a noble guy who has a record as a magistrate or a judge that's pretty decent. There's no squabbles. End of story. That's good. Although if you know the history of Game of Thrones, you know that relatives are easy pickings as far as hostility goes. And Shakespeare and Macbeth, come on. There's plenty of internal squabbling in houses, but the silence.
You just have to come to my place.
The silence of the Bible is so loud to describe the peace of Israel. It's a beautiful description. By not saying there was war, it's saying something delightful about the rule of these two kings. Verse 13, then there's Abdon, the fourth of our judges tonight, the son of Hillel, the Pirathonite, judged Israel after him, and we see now an abundance of family. 40 sons, 30 grandsons. You think, wait a minute, it should be 30 sons and 40 grandsons. You should have more grandsons than sons. It should be multiplying, but it didn't. Who rode on 70 donkeys? Doesn't it sound like a children's song?
It just fascinates
There were 40 sons and 30 grandsons, and they rode on 70 donkeys. You feel a mathematic question coming on. So how many donkeys were there per...
Well, and it also said
Each of them had a donkey.
There you go. There you go. 40 and 30 is 70.
Yeah.
So everybody, son and grandson, rode on a donkey, which was like a Lexus in those days.
Yes.
If you
Yes.
owned a donkey,
Yes.
you are somebody. So wealth is associated now with Abdon. Abdon, Ebed, servant.
Seven, yeah.
Yeah, so he's a worker. And he's the son of Hillel. This is the only Hillel mentioned in the Bible, though we know it much later in 1st century and following. It was a very common Jewish, but not so biblically. Everybody had their own mode of transport in his family. That sounds like they should have had 70 garages. I mean, when you think about it, his wealth is enormous. There's no wealth contrast in the Elon or the Ibzan before him. So we don't know if they're wealthy or just ordinary guys. But this guy, he's up there. This is Donald Trump. He's got plenty. Yeah, plenty of wealth. And he judged Israel 8 years. Then he died and was buried in the land of Ephraim in the hill country of the Amalekites. Probably in his own, he was probably buried back in Ephraim. That was his tribe. So you say, wait a minute, if he's buried in Ephraim, he's probably from Ephraim. If he's from Ephraim, how'd those guys kind of make it back into the power scene? Yeah, the 42,000 were just the liars who were trying to get out before they had to run back home. So here are the Ephraimites, and they still are a powerful tribe. One of their kind made it. My guess, he bought it. He was a rich Ephraimite who bought his way into government. This last one, Abdon. I mean, he's got all this wealth, and he's then buried in Ephraim. So we're making an assumption. It's likely in the hill country of the Amalekites, and they were wanderers, so it's kind of hard to define that. Nobody really agrees on where the Amalekites were at the time. Remember, they were supposed to be eradicated, but they weren't, and that's going to cause more problem for the Jewish people later on. Maybe they're just this decorative, hostile group against the Jewish people throughout history. So that's how we look at this chapter. It's a short chapter. We see Ephraim at the beginning, we see Ephraim at the end. That's the, if you will, inclusio, the beginning and the end of this section. At the beginning, they're coming up in hostility. At the end, they're ruling. Lessons that you can learn from this. What are you going to take away from Judges 12? So you're going to remember that dialects communicate more about you than you may want to reveal about you. Do you think there's anything significant about the length of time that the judges here judged? Jephthah 6 years, Ibzan 7 years, Elon 10 years, Abdon 8 years. Well, it wasn't all peace. Remember, Jephthah didn't have all peace in the beginning, but from then on, some good decades of peace. Those are great times in Israel, against which we're going to see the story comes back, like it always does in the book of Judges, to Israel sinning and falling away and God raising up a judge. But not every judge is raised up to calm God and to answer the people's cry, Lord, we're in trouble. So the cycle, which often is, not always is, Israel's calm or at peace. Then we go into sin. Then God sends bad guys to judge us, and we cry out, help, save us. He sends a judge or a hero, and then he delivers us. God delivers us through the agency of that judge, and then we're at peace. So that's the general cycle in the book of Judges. But we don't see that with these guys. Should we then assume that that cycle does not exist in these matters? Because of the pattern that's already been exposed over and over again, and it's going to happen again with Samson? Yep, I mean, that's possible. The issue of Jephthah is not the one I'm addressing, but the other three judges. Yeah, Jephthah had plenty of trouble internally, and it's reasonable to assume that that cycle about which we spoke is extant. But then it's calm, and for the next three judges, it's calm. Do you think that there was that cycle, and it's about money, don't forget. So the marriage marriage of convenience is what it's officially called in political terms. It got Ferdinand to marry Isabella, and Spain became a unified place in the 15th century, and it's still happening. Danish, it's still happening. Probably in tribal Africa, and it certainly happened here in this history of the Jewish people. So I tend to agree, and therefore disagree with you, but I tend to agree that there was calm, and it's not recorded that there was that falling away, because in the next chapter 13, we're going to see that falling away and the recitation of the cycle. I think the writer knows how to record it. So as a result, I think I read into this that it's calm, and it's a beautiful time in Israel's history. Wonder what it would have been like for us if we were living in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, or whatever they were called in the time. It would have been a nice time. You know, we would have been there working at our olive tree or tending the sheep. Would have been a good time. The Bible is not a comprehensive history of all of time, but it highlights enough history that we who live in this time can sort out how we're supposed to live and how we're not supposed to live.
Amen.
That's the whole point. So when we read, and it seems to be what might be called narrative, just simple line upon line of historical information that has no relevance, it has relevance. The relevance is that my life today doesn't always have grand moments. I don't need grand moments every day. I need once in a while a grand moment. Most of life is boring. On Sunday at a congregation up north, I took a couple Israelis with me who were staying with me on the weekend to go to church. And the pastor gave a great sermon from Romans chapter 8, in which he highlighted the contrast of the suffering in this world is nothing compared to the glory in the next. A great sermon, really. It was very enjoyable to listen to. Afterwards, the pastor made a beeline right to my boys, because I told him before the service that here were a couple Israelis. They'd never been in church before, and it was great. I'm so glad he came right up to them to ask, how was it? How you doing? Nice of you to be here. What'd you think of the service? And they said it was really good. They'd never. One of them asked they were brothers. One of them asked his older brother, how do you say, and it turned out the word was accessible, that God was accessible in church, unlike what he was in synagogue. Mind you, they're secular, so it's not like they go to synagogue anyway. Yeah, but that God was accessible. The words were on the screen. Somebody wrote his own prayers. They noticed that. And who wrote those prayers that the man said? I said, he wrote those himself. Wow. They thought that God was so close to them. That was very nice. So then the younger brother said, but I'm not exactly sure that I agree with you in your sermon. He didn't know what to call it, a drash. And I thought, this is great. This is great. I love this. Just straight, just tell it. And the pastor said, well, what exactly? And he said that you said that the world is terrible and the next world is better. But I think the world's pretty good. And I thought, he's right. It's a great attitude he's got. The pastor was right, because compared to the next, this world is the sewer. But you meet this young man and you'd say he really has a great attitude and he's trying to make the best of life. He fought in the Gaza war, so he's seen the dark side of life. And I just so appreciated them both. I moved into Washington, D.C. mode and became a diplomat and made peace between them, and we had a great 7, 8, 10-minute talk. It was great to see, as the pastor tried to explain, that he was not saying that you shouldn't make the best of this world, but that the next world was just so much better. It was just really good to hear this young man say that he was making the best of the world. He also had great questions to me later as we went back home, and said a lot of things. He said, you're going to fall away, you're going to blow it. A lot of things. So it's just a matter of perspective on life. And I thought that was interesting. And in light of what you said, Lyndon, about the boring, I'm 100% convinced that most of my life is mundane. Most of my life is mundane. So one more time, most of life is boring. And don't despise the boring bits. You can't grow crops if all they see is sunrise or sunset. Sunsets last for a moment. The day lasts a long time. You grow crops in the long time of boredom. You don't grow crop in the sunrise. Those are inspirational. They're wonderful. They're not most of life. Father, thank you for the message that you give us from Judges 12, the message you give us from the book of Judges, the message you give us from your word, the way you communicate to us in words that are expressed and words that are somewhat hidden. Lead us to continue to embrace the word, grow in the word, love the word, and grow because of the word hidden deep in our hearts. Help us in the sunrises, the sunset, inspiration times, and the long, boring times of the day to be your people, whether we're inspired or perspiring, whether we are in the good times or the bad. Help us to be with you. Lord, guard our hearts, guard our lips. We don't want to be like those men of Ephraim who are boasting, and we don't want to be like the ones who buy political power. We just want to be your people today, tomorrow, from now on. Lead us in Yeshua's name.